Hello, welcome to episode 18
Ooh.
of Coach's Corner with Justin and Ethan. I am your trusted coach, Justin Schollard.
And I'm your semi-trusted coach, Ethan Wolf.
Fully trusted, semi-something. Semi-present.
Semaglutide.
Semaglutide. Semaglutide.
Semaglutide.
So today we're going to be talking about genetics and how they impact your health in general.
Yep.
And then also how they more specifically impact your body composition, because I think those two are obviously very intimately related. Not to say that having bad composition is a determining factor in your health, but I think there is a lot of correlation there. So we're going to talk about how far genetics play and how much just environmental influence and circumstantial influences, socioeconomic influences play into our state of health versus what we inherit. So it's a really interesting topic. I've always liked this topic because I've always felt like my I guess, natural genetic upside is I'm tall and I'm just generally pretty thin. So generally
Right.
speaking, one would consider that, hey, you got good genetics.
Yeah, you
But
were dealt a good hand.
Sure. And if I was just like a guy who didn't care about how much muscle mass I had or how I looked, then that would be completely fine. But I've always wanted to be like more muscular and like I've always wanted the things that I just was born with. I always wanted something opposite from what I was born with. And so I've always felt like for me to be what I want, I'm fighting like a little bit of a genetic uphill battle.
Right.
In that
You do
regard.
not have good genetics.
Not in the way like some people do, like,
No, it's the truth.
but I've always rested on the belief that genetics do not doom nor guarantee anything.
That is the truth.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I mean, it's the age-old adverb, right, of like, being somebody who got lucky, but it's basically that like hard work will always trump talent.
Yep.
If talent doesn't work.
Exactly. It reminds me of the episode we did on the difference between men and women,
Yes.
where there's no doubt we'd be naive to think that men don't burn more calories. Of course they build muscle faster, they burn calories faster.
Yes.
But that doesn't mean that if a woman, even if you might burn calories 20% slower than men,
Right.
that your stalwart consistency of just sticking to it and then the accuracy. So if you were very accurate and consistent, whatever marginal benefit a man might have over a woman as far as pure fat loss goes, if you're consistent and accurate, I mean, I've seen it happen where women in their 60s can lose 20 pounds in 2 months.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that's the behavioral changes that can affect your body composition, are the consistency really is the truth. It's the thing that's going to make the most difference over time. And everybody still gets the benefit from the same behaviors, right? If you do resistance training, even if you build muscle mass at a slightly slower rate, whether you're a man or a woman based on genetic variances, doesn't mean you're not going to get the benefit from doing exercise and lifting weights.
Totally.
And so I think it's like one of those things where you have to start, competing with yourself in the situation in the realm of genetics and who's got better genetics, quote unquote.
Because I feel like everyone just goes straight towards, when they say hormones, what they're really saying is it's like if I say, oh, I think it's my hormones, it's kind of like another way of saying, oh, just my genetics don't allow for this or whatever.
Yeah, pretty much.
And obviously, like, if you're born 5 feet tall, then you're born 5 feet tall. You can get some knee extensions maybe, but or they can extend your shins.
Yeah. Oh,
cut those shins open and put some
just
spacers in there.
The spacers. Take a year and a half, give you a couple inches.
Yeah, but barring that, you got to just live with being 5 feet tall. But regardless, though, I mean, if someone says, "Oh, I'm just big boned," or my genetics, or don't let me do it, I can't accept that as truth.
Yeah.
It's like, well, are you doing everything possible to express your genetics?
Of course. Well, that's
your genetic potential, I should say.
Yeah, and that's the thing. I think, we all have a potential regardless of what our genetic ceiling might be. And I think it's like until you've absolutely maxed out your potential, you shouldn't even just worry about the genetic card.
Right.
It's just not something that's worth the time and energy, because in a certain sense, you can change some genetic expressions, as we'll talk about soon. But fundamentally, you're the person that is 5 feet tall is probably never going to be in the NBA. That's just the way that's going to be based on the sport. And hopefully they didn't have that lifelong dream. But fundamentally, until that potential is maximized, I think like putting genetics into the equation just doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah.
Because until you've started to maximize the behaviors that you can make a change with, what's the point in naming genetics as a reason that you're not where you want to be? Because realistically, even with any type of genetic limitation, outside of trying to be a foot taller if you're 5 feet tall, in terms of body composition, muscle mass, maybe pain in your joints from lack of movement, cognitive ability,
right,
heart disease prevention, whatever you want to look at it. Like there's so many variables that you can positively affect through your behavior that I think genetics is kind of like this like Wizard of Oz curtain that people like to hide behind.
100%.
This big bad, like it's genetics and I can't.
Well, it's just like I get to, I get to transfer responsibility to something outside of me.
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's always going to be people who would prefer to do that rather than to just take full responsibility for where they're at in their life and have to do something about it and actually just work really hard and make and that might mean getting up at 5 a.m. If the only time you can work out is 6 a.m., that might mean you have to just get up at 5 now.
Right.
Or work out when you put the kids down at 8, you might have to work out at 8:30, and that sucks. But it's not genetics in that regard. It's just it's a lifestyle choice, and I know that's hard for people to hear. And everyone's defends their position,
of course.
But I've just seen it. I've just seen it happen too many times.
Yeah,
where people do click, despite the reality of their circumstances, they do click into gear, and it's like a light switch that goes off, and they just commit, and then despite whatever genetic predisposition they think they have, all of a sudden they put on muscle, they lose body fat, they look like $1 million, and it's like, yeah. Because what I'm seeing, when we were preparing for this episode, I was reading a Harvard Medical article on how big of a role genetics play, and like it's tough to like you can't. Some studies will say you got as much as it's 70 to 80% of your body composition is a predisposition from genetics.
Yep.
Other studies suggest only 25%. So it's like,
yeah, it's tricky. Well, and I think one of the things is that, like culturally, genetics is kind of like the be all end all. Like you can't change your genetics. And so I think it's one of why it's such a safety blanket to hide under for behavior change. Mm-hmm. And for me, it's like I would almost rather people just admit that they just don't want to do it, or they don't want to wake up at 5 a.m. to do the workout, and right. they just don't do it, and then just say that it's not doing it versus like hiding under the blanket of genetics. Like I'd almost rather transparency and just like keep it real with like maybe you're just not choosing that choice, which is you have autonomy to live your life however you want.
Right.
But don't make it a like I can't because of genetics, and so now I'm not going to choose that path. And, I'd at least rather honesty, or just at least the self-awareness to get out of the bridge, the troll bridge of genetics. It's
I think that like, yeah, exactly. And I think that like there's I think a way to understand it a little bit better. If we look at this range of like, okay, let's just say we're talking about obesity, and somewhere between 20 to 80% of your body composition is a predisposition from genetics. So that's somewhere in the 20 to 80%.
Somewhere in that 20 to 80.
So what I found is that here's how you can know how far on that scale you would be. Okay, so
give it to me.
Maybe you're closer to the 80% of genetics influencing your predisposition if you have been overweight your whole life. One or both of your parents or several other blood relatives are significantly overweight, or if both parents have obesity, you're likely developing obesity as high as 80%. So in other words, if all those other factors play in, then you have like an 80% chance of being obese yourself in that regard. Now, how do we know if we're on the other end of that spectrum, but maybe we're still talking about two people who have high BMIs and are considered obese.
Right.
If maybe you're on the lower end of how much your genes influence that versus your lifestyle, if you are strongly influenced by the availability of food. So it's more of like you're food motivated, in other words.
Right.
Maybe if it is more genetic, then maybe it would be like I don't feel like I eat that much. I'm not really even that.
I don't care.
Snack.
Yeah, I don't eat fast food. It's just
right.
It just seems like the weight doesn't come off.
And that's very subjective. You'd have to be really honest to make sure. Right. But or you're moderately overweight now, but when you do follow reasonable diets and exercise programs, you see results. That would indicate that you're on the lower end of the spectrum. If like it's not actually that much genetics, it's just more lifestyle. So if you do exercise and you do eat well, the weight does tend to fall off of you.
Interesting, yeah.
Right? Versus if you're on the higher end, more like 80% influenced by genetics, then maybe you work out all the time and you're not even eating that much and you just can't lose weight. That would indicate more of a genetic predisposition to obesity versus somebody. Yeah, and then the last one is you regain lost weight during the holiday season, for example, after changing your eating and exercise habits, or at times when you experience physiological or social problems. And so in other words, like your weight fluctuation is it's congruent with just like life happening.
Right.
You go through a bad breakup.
It's vacation.
It's vacation, and then your weight goes up, and then it goes down. When so if you see fluctuation, and that's actually most people, I think, in my experience.
Yes, yeah,
like
would say so.
When you actually get somebody, like very rarely do we get somebody who is like they're perfect and the scale's just not budging. Like very rarely do you see that, but it does happen. I have met people that are like that, versus people who. Let's just be honest, you stop eating so much and you lose weight. It's like, it's not genetics. It's just we've got some other issues that we have to deal with.
Right. You have a bunch of birthdays in a row and you gain some weight.
Yeah.
You know, it's just one of those things.
Right.
It's the ups and downs of life. I mean,
yeah. Or we're just not controlling our lifestyle choices that well,
yeah.
you know? And so that was an interesting way to kind of figure out what end of that spectrum of how much of your weight gain is genetics versus just circumstances.
It's just so interesting. I mean, it's such a hard one because there are so many environmental factors that go into, you know, your amount of fat you have.
Totally.
I mean, in that kind of vein, it was very interesting. One of the things I was reading was the efficiency in which a person uses calories, which includes an array of processes, but is kind of genetically determined, and that the people that are more efficient at using calories will actually be the ones that tend to gain weight easier. Because if they were to eat 1,000 calories, they utilize 900 of them easily, and so they've reached the amount of energy that they need, and therefore if you eat more, that's a surplus and gets stored as fat. Whereas somebody who's inefficient at utilizing those calories from an array of processes that are determined by your genetics will then only get 600 calories out of the 1,000, but they really needed the 900, and so they have to eat more food in order just to get to what is accepted or needed, and therefore do not gain weight as easily. So it's like the lack of efficiency actually aids them, and they might be a contributing factor to those people that, like, no matter what he eats or no matter what she eats, she's always got abs or she's always looking thin.
I've heard that before, actually. It's so counterintuitive. It's like actually having a high metabolism is at an evolutionary disadvantage.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
It's wild.
And people who are more like mesomorphic in their shape and they just tend to be stockier without having to eat a lot of food are actually more evolutionarily advanced.
Yeah, they're the ones who are going to survive those harder winters much easier.
Right.
It's wild. It's wild. And, you know, it's like, and I want, you know, people that might be listening to understand that, like, genetics influence so many processes in our body. It's wild. You know, it's very, you know, without getting into the actual, like, specific C1-4 genes and this kind of a thing, you know, it's everything from, like, iron absorption and how well you methylate, which is adding a methyl group to any type of compound, which can be DNA, it can be proteins, it can be minerals and other things like that. You know, I think we talked about methylated B12 in a previous episode. And so your body's ability to methylate is also genetically determined. You know what I mean? It's so there's so many variables that are happening in our body. You know, the ability to absorb the vitamin D, for example, vitamin B, all of it. You know, iron. It's just, there are so many things that we talked about in a previous episode about beta carotene, which is considered vitamin A, but it's really actually beta carotene, and your body has to convert the beta carotene into vitamin A, and that rate or efficiency of transforming those two compounds varies from person to person. And so you might eat a certain amount of carrots and say, I'm getting 100% of my vitamin A. You over here might actually get 80%. This person over here might only get 40%. So the genetic variances range not only just like, oh, I build muscle easier or I have a higher metabolism, but it affects pretty much everything that our body does in a lot of ways. So outside of how tall we can be, maybe.
Right.
But in terms of internal processes and things that might affect our health, there's just it's not cut and dry in any way.
Yeah, you see it a lot too with like hormones, testosterone for men, these types of things. It's like there's so many layers to it, and one thing that I have been coming up more and more is like men are younger and younger now going on like testosterone replacement therapy.
Yeah.
Because they have low T, but it's like, I mean, I think like a 25, 27-year-old guy going on TRT, it's like, dude, like I was a trainer when I was 25. So I was like a little bit more aware, but I was still my lifestyle was just such a hot mess. So every weekend I was up all night, drinking too much, partying too much.
Yeah, living the good life.
Living it up. And that's why that's why someone's testosterone in that case would be down, not necessarily because you were born with like hypogonadal or something, right?
Absolutely.
And if your testosterone is low and you're a 25-year-old man, it's probably just because you're drinking too much, you're not sleeping, you're not lifting weights, or there's just issues with your lifestyle that you clean up, and it could incredibly improve your hormonal situation without having to seek external intervention.
Absolutely. And I think people don't realize, like, if you actually have a medical condition that prevents testosterone production, like, it's going to be beyond low. It's not going to be like 200, or at the bottom of the acceptable range. I think it's like 250 or something like that, up to like 800 or 900.
Yeah, 300. Anything below 300, I think you'd be diagnosed like hypogonadal.
But it's like people think that, like, people are at the lower range and they're just like, oh man. But like people are like the few people I know that are actually like that, they had like 100.
Yeah.
Or something extremely low. Things that are actually going to affect your health adversely, and not just be like, oh man, I was in the low 300s. There's something wrong with me. Chaining it to what the conversation you just had about all the things that you might be doing that might not be aiding.
Because that's what you find when you research how much do my genetics impact any legit source.
Yeah.
They're not going to just say, oh yeah. Maybe people search for that because they're looking for answers. They want confirmation of their own bias in a lot of ways. Well, maybe I just have bad genetics, and like these are very smart researchers with PhDs that study this stuff and do control group studies and clinical trials, and they find that it's like so much of it just depends on your life circumstance and behavior, because we can express our genes,
right?
Even though we might, like, everyone has genes for cancer, everyone has genes for muscle, everyone has genes for whatever, and
Alzheimer's,
it's just like, Alzheimer's, everything. Is just what is
Parkinson's,
getting expressed, and that is directly influenced by lifestyle. Like,
yes, and this is, I think a lot of people don't really realize this. They think that genes are fixed, and I think it's one of the reasons why kind of the attitude of that. Well, I can kind of blame my genetics or assume it's my genetics, even if it's not like blaming it and purposely using it as, some type of an scapegoat, but that genetics was this kind of be all end all. You can't change your genetics. You were born with them. It's what you are. You're blonde haired. You're always going to be blonde. You're not going to turn into a brown haired individual,
exactly.
right?
Right. There are fixed things, but like internal stuff,
and the external stuff. And so, what we're talking about here, people, is epigenetics. Right. Yeah. It's kind of a little bit of a hot topic more now, but it's basically the study of how, like, your behaviors and your environment affect the way your genes work or the expressions of your genes. And so fundamentally, you can't change your DNA sequences. Those are the things you really can't change. Right. So you are, in a certain sense, we are given a certain coding, you could say, a certain computer code that makes up who we are. And fundamentally, we can't change those sequences, but we can change how those sequences are expressed, is kind of the idea with epigenetics. And so it's one of those things that you were saying, like, we all have cancer genes, right? Every single person has genes that might be more prone to cancer, less prone to cancer, of all different kinds. And there is where the ability to affect how those genes that are related to cancer may or may not come to fruition is going to be based on. lifestyle choices, you know, in our environment, and that's, you know, in our behavior, which is kind of wild because now it kind of puts the ball in our hands in a lot of ways.
Yeah, nothing's doomed or guaranteed by your genetics, but, you know, anecdotally, my genetics would be probably thinner, right? But through, you know, the high protein levels and consistent weight training forever and just all that stuff, you know, like maybe if I had better genetics, I would be 30 pounds more muscle with the same effort. But because of that, you know, it's almost like we can live up to our own potential by expressing our epigenome.
Yes.
Or if we don't, then we will sort of decline to our lowest common sort of denominator in our genetic potential as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. However, what's interesting, so there's all this stuff, right? I think that my point earlier was that it's very hard to find any conclusive yes or no, because it's not binary. People are looking for a binary answer to something that's on a spectrum. It's like everyone has the potential to be a little obese. Everyone has the potential to be thin. It's just sort of like a lot of it depends on our lifestyle. But the reality is, in that same Harvard article, how much our environment impacts this is that in 1970, on average, Americans spent 25% of their food budget on takeout or just home food away from home.
Yes.
Now we're spending over 50%. So what is that? Like 100% increase?
Yeah.
In our food budget is now being spent on it's everywhere. Everywhere you go, it's convenient food. It's hot dogs, burgers. It's like, it's so fast. It's so readily available. And like the average supersized meal, which is not even that much food, like volume wise, is 1,500 to 2,000 calories. And so it's what's interesting, I think, is when you think about epigenetics, and we can express our own epigenome, but then we also pass on to the next generation the genes that we've expressed in our lifetime.
Yes.
So we're
up to like 3 generations. It's wild.
Right. So now you see where it's just this runaway system with the current state of this country and a lot of developed countries of just how obesity is just hockey stick J-curving straight up, because almost as though you're seeing the exponentiality of the previous generations from 50 years ago, 1970.
Yeah.
We've just gotten more convenient. We move less. The calorie density is much higher now. Everything's convenient and instant and online. And so it's like every time a generation comes and goes like that and they express that obesity gene and then they send it off to their kids now, and those kids are born with it and they express it and pass it on. It's almost like you see it just turning into this like exponential runaway system.
Yeah, I mean, I forget which episode, but I was talking about where they basically were saying that even in affluent houses, that basically was in like the 50s and 60s, where KFC started to advertise to housewives at home, and that they basically were saying that even the poorer households in America were generally eating like 80% more home-cooked meals than the affluent or rich households in America. And that fundamentally, even though they were growing up poorer, that the fact that they were eating home-cooked food was leading to much more nutritional value and less obesity and all that kind of stuff. And it's so wild to think about, you pass down these potential traits to your kids because it's like you live it first. Your genes are like, all right, this is what we're doing. And then they get spit out. But there is, and in the opposite of that, there are plenty of studies that show the positive benefit of exercise. Surprise, surprise. And, so there's this one that basically now it says lifelong, but that lifelong physical activity leads to epigenetic modifications in skeletal muscle that basically show insulin sensitivity, glycolytic and oxidative metabolism, and muscle regeneration all going positively. So that fundamentally, those are all qualities that you could be passing down to your children by fundamentally exercising as a lifelong practice. Yeah. And then there was other ones that were a little more increased in terms, or a little more focused in terms of, they basically took muscle samples of somebody just before a good exercise session and right afterwards.
Ow.
I know, yeah.
It's like biopsy your muscle. Now go do some squats.
Oh God, it just seemed rough. But basically, they found that there are much less methylated genes in the muscle, and what methylation does in terms of epigenetics is turns off a gene. And so there was much less methylation, meaning that the genes were able to express themselves, and those genes were responsible for protein synthesis and muscle regeneration and muscle hypertrophy. And so basically, genetically, they found that somebody who just worked out had more gene expression leading to muscle generation and muscle hypertrophy. And that basically, if you don't work out, your body has this process of methylation that kind of dumbs down your muscles' growth.
Use it or lose it.
Yeah, you're basically like,
right?
we're not going to put energy into this unless you show a demand. Oh, you've shown a demand? We're going to stop methylation, which is going to let the genes express themselves that are related to muscle generation and hypertrophy. And so, it's like, it's right there. It's like, and it's even, there's actually like, I think it was in 2011, they came up with an epigenetic diet. And so pollutants are a big one that's negative in your environment. Obviously, emotional states. So being extremely stressed and being extremely angry can also affect your epigenetic expression.
Well, that goes back to our episode on stress and cortisol, of just like if you're on this constant state of cortisol, one of the things that it does is shuts down non-vital systems, and one of them being protein synthesis.
Protein synthesis, exactly. But it's really interesting, like resveratrol, which comes from like red grapes and red wine. They had another one. There was
to avoid that one?
No, that basically increase epigenetic expression for the better, especially in terms of like cancers and diseases and autoimmune diseases. But like there's a compound in soy that they were referring to. There's something in broccoli as well that basically all affect your epigenetic expression for the better in terms of like autoimmune disease, so if you were like a cancer.
If you're like a vegan wino,
you're just good to go. That's the best epigenetic diet there is.
Who lifts weights?
But I guess what I'm trying to drive home is that it's that the potential of what you've already got and how it expresses itself is really determined by so many different things. It's not just do you exercise or are you stressed, but it's like your food too. It's everything. And,
totally.
Fundamentally eating whole foods and a little more plant variety and all that kind of stuff is most likely going to lead to the prevention of some maybe autoimmune disease. Like you might not get your psoriasis that might run in the family or whatever it might be.
And then also to that point, learning a martial art, learning an instrument, learning a new language, going out and playing sports where you're engaged, maybe some form of dementia runs in your family. Like so much of that can be avoided through constantly learning new things, forcing your brain to develop and rewire itself, and learning a sport. And so I think people hear people like you and I talk about all these things you should do. You got to eat more vegetables. And it can be overwhelming. But it's so important to realize it doesn't need to be so crazy. Like you don't have to dedicate your life to, the epigenome diet and then training every single day. Like literally 20 minutes of moderate, intense exercise 4 or 5 days a week, 3 days a week, for Christ's sakes.
I mean, even just walking.
Just
We've
walking.
talked about it. Yeah, it's like
just doing that. Like what? Like if you're a noob, three 20-minute sessions, 20-minute full body sessions a week, and a walk every day.
Yeah.
And then just add a little bit more veggie and protein to your diet.
Just try to eat some more whole foods.
Do that for a year and tell me you have not dramatically improved the quality of your life.
Absolutely.
And then you can build from there, right?
Yeah.
But I mean, just small little changes can make such a huge impact.
100%.
Yeah.
And I think the optimal road to walk in terms of all this is pretty obvious. Exercise as much as you can, but I like your point there.
Take out video games, keep the blackout curtains drawn.
6 packs, and
no water,
no,
just soda,
just sun-kissed,
mountain beer and mountain beer, Coors.
But yeah, I think there's a middle ground. I mean, and I know it's like telling somebody to take a deep breath when they're in a high stress environment or situation. It's almost impossible sometimes, right? Like, yeah, does deep breathing help you regulate your stress response? Totally. But like you just got into an accident and some guy's road raging at you, even though it was his fault. Try to take a deep breath. You know, it's like, it's not always the easiest thing said than done, but at the same time, there is a path to walk that a little bit of effort can have a very large impact. And I think to agree with you in that it's not so much that like you have to be perfect or do these things to optimize things as much as that this stuff really matters, and that I think the quality of your life can really be changed with a few decisions. And sometimes those decisions might be easier than others, and they might take a little commitment and dedication, and you might have a couple hiccups here and there, but that, you know, it's not so much of like, oh, it's like we know what's best or a high horse. It's as much as that like you can live a better life with just a couple of decisions in these different directions that might impact your grandchildren, right? You know, and it's like, you know, I guess that makes it sound super serious, but it's just like, you know, we all want to live better lives. We all want to be happier. We all want to be pain-free. We all want to be able to move well or play with our kids or just, you know, have a better life fundamentally. And I think the idea is just, you know, you don't got to be an Olympian.
Right. And I think that like when we talk to people and we're like, you know, what are your goals? And we get them in that state of mind where they're envisioning and it's aspirational. Yes, everybody's like, I want to be more muscular. I want to be stronger. I want to have less body fat. I want to have more energy.
I want to look good.
I want to look
be sexy.
good. Yeah, all the things, because they see how their life could be. But that's a very, you know, it's hard because it's like very easy in the moment when you're not thinking long term anymore. You're just kind of like in survival mode and you're just thinking about the day to just, it's very easy to, it's very addictive, I should say, to think that it's something outside of you that's determining the quality of your life. Like it's my genetics, or it's the place I was born, or it's whatever. And listen, there are people that are truly affected because of their genetic situation, right? It happens. But it's more rare than you think. For 90% of us, it is more lifestyle factors than it is the true fact that you have genes that are just, no matter what you do, you cannot lose weight. It exists, but it's way less common than I think people would like to believe, because it's just easier to think that it's something outside of us and that you know, nothing I can do, versus, you know what, got to get up earlier, got to get that walk in, got to start grocery shopping more. I mean, because I talk to people every week like this, and like this isn't just like my opinion. This is like thousands of phone calls with people who want to lose 50 or more pounds over the last however many years, and it's like they all tend to eat out too much. They all tend to move way too little.
Yep.
All right, and there's just some common denominators here, and it's like, it just means to take responsibility, essentially, which is difficult.
Fundamentally, yeah. You know, and it's like, it's just because you didn't win the, you know, genetic lottery jackpot, doesn't mean you don't have the responsibility of improving your physique per se.
Totally.
You know, and I think it's, unless you did want to be in the NBA and you're only 5'2", well then I'm sorry.
You better be really fucking good.
Have you ever seen The Professor
Muggsy
from
Bogues.
And One? Yeah, and there's that professor, you know, from the street ball old guys. Dude,
that was awesome.
He is a boss, dude. He still makes content.
Really?
And he's just so good. He's just so good. He's tiny, but he's just so good.
Yeah.
It's undeniable. And, you know, and again, it's like, I think the most important thing is that it's like, again, it goes back to when we were talking about social media. It's like you have these people that are these kind of exceptions and are these kind of Adonises that get on social media and they work hard and they're genetically gifted. And then that's our point of comparison. It is, yeah. And that's our point of comparison. Mm-hmm. And we're looking at these people with beautiful physiques that have also developed a lifestyle that might take some time that we might be able to do as well. But and then we're comparing ourselves to them, and we think we can emulate them. And if we buy their program or we work out like them, we'll look like them. And that might never be the case. And so I think it's just, always compare yourself to yourself and just, you know, compare yourself to how you've done better, not what you haven't done.
Totally. Which is hard to do, you know, if you hold yourself to high standards and you want, you know, you're always kind of beating yourself up for could have done better. And that's true. You could have.
It's always possible.
But it's also, that's not doing you any good either, because it's just making you feel like a failure versus like, hey, what progress have I made?
Yeah.
And to that point, when just because somebody has really good genetics, they might not be consistent. Like you could, like, and there's nothing. We all know people who they have a great symmetry, they have a good frame, they kind of carry like a good amount of natural muscle, but they're all over the place. They miss workouts, their diet's like shit. Versus somebody who may not have all that, but they just continue to put one foot in front of the other, and they show up every day, they hit their numbers, they do their workouts. Eventually that person with maybe C+ genetics is going to catch up. It's just a matter of time. So genetics don't doom or guarantee anything. It might make your process a little bit easier if you have killer genes. Good for you if you do, but the rest of us, it's like, be surprised how damn good you can make it.
100%. I agree. It's amazing what hard work will do. I think 99% of people with hard work will have a physique that would be impressive to the other 99% of people.
Definitely.
Right? Like, I don't think there's that many people that are so genetically ungifted that with hard work and dedication that you would look at them and be like, ugh. Like, you suck, or you're flat, you're lame, you don't look good at all. I think anybody, even if you're skinny and you always, quote, stay skinny, I think you can get filled out to your capacity, and you look at that person and be like, you look good, dude.
Totally. Yeah. Yep, for sure. Well, so there you go, guys. I think that's our 2 cents here on genetics. And the big takeaway is just be consistent.
Do your best to be consistent.
Lifestyle, baby. Very rarely
it's simple but not easy, but you can do it.
Very rarely is your body composition a predetermined from your genetics. It happens, but very rarely. Usually it's just...
And even if it is
we need to clean up
somewhat determined, you can still have an effect through lifestyle choices.
Clean up your lifestyle.
But you got this.
Yeah. All right, team. I'll check you all next time. That was episode 18 of Coach's Corner. Adios.
Peace out.